that of the ancient Persian Empire, the lives of royal princesses were defined by a complex balance of privilege, duty, and political control. From birth, these women were not seen as free individuals, but as vital pieces within an imperial structure that needed to secure alliances, legitimize lineages, and strengthen the monarch's authority. For the princesses, childhood rarely included spontaneous affection, natural friendships, or personal decisions. From a very young age, they were reminded that their marriage would not be a personal union, but a political instrument that should reinforce the stability of the kingdom. Therefore, the wedding night was not an intimate moment, but a ritual laden with political and religious meaning, and above all, expectations that created fear. Persian wedding ceremonies were shrouded in solemnity and symbolism. The princess knew that her behavior would be observed, interpreted, and judged as a reflection of her family's honor. This pressure, built up throughout her education, made many young women experience anxiety and fear, even before they fully understood what the union with their future husband meant. From childhood, the princesses were subjected to a strict educational system focused on discipline, modesty, and emotional control. They had to learn history, etiquette, moral philosophy, domestic management, and religious rituals. The most important education was in purity. The young women were repeatedly told they must enter marriage without the slightest hint of improper behavior. The social and political consequences of any rumors could be devastating for their family. This pressure created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that profoundly influenced their psychology. The concept of purity was not limited to visible behavior. There were rituals, inspections, and ceremonies related to family honor. Although not all of these procedures were humiliating, they were extremely demanding and reinforced the idea that the princess's body did not belong to her, but was a symbol under the custody of the state and her lineage. Princesses rarely met their future husbands before marriage. Arrangements were made between royal families, nobles, or even allied leaders, seeking to strengthen alliances. In many cases, the future husband could be decades older, from another region of the empire, or have political responsibilities that made him distant and uncomprehending. This uncertainty about the personality, character, and intentions of the husband generated anxiety in the young women. They didn't know how they would be treated, what expectations would be placed on them, or what their new life far from the palace would be like. The wedding night then became a symbol of all the unknowns, a crossing between two worlds where the princess had to demonstrate obedience without emotional preparation. The royal marriage in Persia was not just a legal union, it was a ceremony filled with religious symbolism, observed by priests, nobles, and state representatives. The princess had to follow a strict series of steps, including heavy ceremonial dresses, prayers, purifications, and solemn oaths. These preparations, although sacred, increased emotional pressure. All eyes were on her, every gesture interpreted as a sign of virtue or weakness. The ritualistic atmosphere reinforced the idea that the wedding night was not a personal moment but a public act surrounded by political and religious expectations. Unlike common women who had family advice, princesses lived in an extremely controlled environment where emotions were seen as a political risk. They rarely received honest guidance about marriage, Nurses, governesses, and counsellors were prohibited from openly discussing intimate matters. This left the princess without emotional tools to face her transition into marriage. The wedding night thus appeared as an event surrounded by unknowns, taboos, and fears that no one could clarify. Institutional silence created an environment of confusion. The princess could not express doubts or concerns. Any sign of nervousness could be interpreted as a lack of preparation, or worse, as dishonour to her family. In the Persian Empire, a princess's marriage had a central goal: to ensure legitimate offspring. The lineage was vital to the kingdom's stability, and the woman's fertility was seen as a state matter. The pressure to fulfill this role from the very first night was enormous. The princess knew that her future in the court depended on her ability to conceive heirs. Concubines, rival nobles, and political factions could use any delay, difficulty, or rumour to delegitimize her. The fear of failing, disappointing, or being replaced created unbearable tension. This political weight turned the wedding night into a test upon which not only her status, but the stability of diplomatic alliances between families and rulers depended. After the marriage, many princesses were moved to new residences far from their families of origin. They had to adapt to new customs, new hierarchies, new codes of conduct, and new environments. The wedding night marked the beginning of this transition, symbolizing the renouncement of their previous identity. The sense of loss of control was profound. The princess understood that her fate was no longer tied to her own decisions, but to the will of others. Her husband, her mother-in-law, political counsellors, priests, and diplomats. This radical change explains why the wedding night was not seen as an intimate event, but as a threshold to a completely new and, in many cases, unpredictable existence. The real reason Persian princesses feared their wedding night was not due to one single factor, but to the sum of all the elements that defined their lives. Political pressure, rigid education, institutional silence, uncertain marriages, fertility expectations, loss of autonomy, and constant surveillance. For them, the wedding night represented the culmination of an entire life under control, discipline, and impossible expectations. It was the symbol of an inevitable transition into an unknown future, where every step would be observed, judged, and politically used. The fear was not irrational. It was the logical result of a system that turned intimacy into a public act, youth into a diplomatic tool, and personal life into a duty to the state. Despite this, many princesses found ways to adapt, influence the court, gain power, and leave a legacy. But their initial fear reveals a profound truth about the position of women in imperial politics. Even surrounded by wealth, they lived under the shadow of a destiny marked by obligations far greater than themselves. In the vast political web of the Persian Empire, princesses were not seen as domestic figures, but as diplomatic instruments of the highest value. Every arranged marriage had the power to consolidate alliances, avoid wars, secure tribute, or even stabilize border territories. This political dimension made the princess aware that her fate was subordinated to strategic interests much broader than her personal life. The marriage agreement could unite two enemy dynasties that had been at odds for generations, or seal pacts between regions with shared commercial tensions. The princess figure functioned as a living symbol of the newly established peace. and her presence in a foreign court represented the continuation of that alliance. However, this burden provoked deep fear. If the alliance failed, the princess could become a political hostage, a scapegoat, or a bargaining chip. In this context, the wedding night took on an additional meaning. It not only marked the beginning of her marital life, but also the formal fulfillment of the political agreement. Any delay, misunderstanding, or gesture interpreted as a lack of willingness could have serious consequences for both families. This responsibility, placed on young and inexperienced shoulders, fueled a silent fear that accompanied the princess long before entering her bridal chambers. Numerous legends, didactic tales, and myths circulated in Persian society to reinforce the obedience of noble women. Many of these stories recounted the tragic fate of queens and princesses who had defied norms or shown weakness in their marriage. Although some had historical roots, they were often exaggerated to shape female behavior. Tales of former consorts punished for disobeying protocols, queens exiled for failing to please their husbands, or princesses used as moral examples circulated within the palaces. These stories were repeated by nurses, scribes, and attendants, not as literal warnings but as reminders of social expectations. Over time, these stories became part of the emotional education of young women. Princesses grew up hearing anecdotes about women who had failed in their political role, who had shown insecurity during the wedding ritual, or who had endangered their family's position. These narratives, filled with symbolism, fueled a negative anticipation of the wedding night. It was not merely a ceremonial act, it was a moral test that would determine her fate within the palace. The harem system, present in various eras and regions of the Persian world, added another layer of tension to the lives of the princesses. Although these women were part of a higher stratum than many other consorts, they had to live in an environment where competition was intense, subtle, and permanent. The arrival of a royal princess triggered multiple reactions: jealousy, intrigue, political calculations, and temporary alliances. The wedding night was not only observed by the outer court, but also evaluated by the harem itself. The most influential women, the king's mothers, former concubines, administrators, and internal priestesses, judged every detail of the newcomer's behavior. Disobedience could be interpreted as arrogance, a sign of nervousness as incapacity, a gesture out of protocol as ignorance. The princesses knew that how they began their married life would influence their future position within this complex female microcosm. Thus, the fear was not only due to marrying an unknown husband, but also the hierarchical system surrounding them, a web of watchful eyes, calculated silences, and strict expectations. In addition to political and social responsibilities, the Persian royal wedding was steeped in spiritual rituals. There were purifications, symbolic readings, and ceremonies dedicated to deities representing fertility, fate, and protection. While these traditions aim to ensure a successful marriage, they also added another layer of solemnity and psychological pressure. Before the wedding night, princesses had to undergo ritual baths, anointings with aromatic oils, and prayers led by specialized priests or priestesses. Every gesture was a reminder of their duty to embody purity, obedience, and sacred continuity. Furthermore, prophecies and omens played an important role. Any bad omen, Even something as simple as a dropped object or a candle blowing out was interpreted as a sign that the princess had to behave with absolute precision to avoid bringing misfortune upon the kingdom. Viewed from this spiritual perspective, marriage was not a union between two individuals, but a cosmic act that affected the harmony of the universe. For a young princess, this vision generated profound fear, the fear of making a mistake that could alter not only her own life, but the fate of her people.